I parked my truck at the trailhead just as the sun started rising. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your lungs feel fresh but stings a little when you breathe in too fast. My plan was simple: an all-day solo hike through the backcountry, no distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. I had done hikes like this before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the morning or the way the trees seemed to press in closer than usual. I shook the feeling off and adjusted my pack, double-checking my gear one last time before heading in. The first few miles were easy, a well-worn trail winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the bushes signaled small animals darting away. I felt at ease, the rhythm of my steps settling into a natural pace. I checked my map at a clearing, orienting myself toward the less traveled section of the trail. It would be tougher going, but I liked a challenge. After another hour, I reached a fork. The main trail veered left, but the path I wanted, a narrow, overgrown one, continued straight. I hesitated for a second before pushing forward. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind barely made a sound through the branches. The only noise was the crunch of my boots on the leaf-covered ground. As I walked, I noticed the trail hadn't been used in a while. Fallen branches crisscrossed the path, and thick patches of moss covered the rocks. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree that blocked the way completely. It struck me as odd. This trail was on my map, but it looked like no one had been through here in years. Still, I pressed on. The solitude was what I had come for. An hour later, I stopped for a break near a small stream. I knelt to splash cold water on my face, relishing the chill against my skin. As I straightened up, something caught my eye. A boot print in the mud near the water's edge. It was fresh. My first thought was relief. I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Maybe another hiker had taken this route recently, but something felt off. The print was deep, heavier than a regular hiking boot, like whoever made it had been carrying a lot of weight or had been standing there for a long time. I shook the feeling off and continued. The further I went, the stranger things became. At one point, I spotted deep claw marks on a tree trunk, too large to belong to any small animal. The undergrowth had been trampled down in places, as if something big had moved through. I told myself it was just a bear, but a pit of unease settled in my stomach. By midday, I was deep into the wilderness. I hadn't seen any signs of people since the footprint, and my unease had grown stronger. Every so often, I caught the faintest sound of movement in the distance. Not the scampering of small animals, but something heavier. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I turned a bend and saw a pile of bones, I stopped cold. They were old, picked clean by scavengers, but the way they were stacked didn't look natural. They weren't scattered like an animal kill, they were placed, arranged. My stomach twisted as I examined them. Deer bones, mostly, but in the center of the pile was something else. A rusted hunting knife, half buried in the dirt, its blade stained dark. I reached down but stopped before touching it. A heavy silence pressed in around me, and suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. Nothing, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I told myself it was just nerves. I had hiked alone before, but something about this place felt different, felt wrong. Deciding I had seen enough, I turned around, picking up my pace. My plan had been to loop through and come out on another trail, but now all I wanted was to go back the way I came. The further I walked, the more I had the sense that something was behind me. I would stop and listen, but there was nothing, just silence. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw it, about 50 yards ahead, off the trail. A structure. My breath caught in my throat. It was a small wooden cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, The wood darkened with age, the windows nothing but gaping black holes. I hadn't seen it on my map. I shouldn't have seen it at all. There were no marked structures in this part of the forest. Something told me to turn back, to ignore it. But my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stepped closer. The air smelled different here. Musty, rotten, like something had been left to decay. The front door was slightly open, creaking softly in the wind. I peered inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out a table, a chair, and something in the far corner. Pile of something. My gut told me to leave, but I stepped inside anyway. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and old wood. I approached the pile in the corner, my flashlight casting long shadows. My stomach turned. It was clothing. Old, torn jackets, boots, a backpack with the zipper half open. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or never left at all. Then the sound came, a branch snapping outside. My breath hitched. I turned off my flashlight, heart pounding. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. My brain raced. I had to get out, but if I ran, whoever or whatever was out there would hear me. More footsteps, closer now. I gripped my knife, barely breathing. The door, still slightly open, creaked again. Then silence. I counted the seconds, forcing myself to stay still. Then, with every ounce of control, I moved. Slow, steady, one foot in front of the other. When I reached the door, I paused. The forest was still, too still. Then, movement in my peripheral vision. A figure, just beyond the trees. Tall, motionless, watching. My body went cold. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. Branches whipped against my face as I sprinted back toward the trail. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until I reached the main trail. Only then did I slow down, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest stood silent, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But just before I turned onto the main road, I saw something. A figure, standing just beyond the tree-line. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. And I never returned to that trail. I never wanted to hike alone. I always told myself I wouldn't. But when plans fell through and I was already packed for the weekend, I figured I'd go anyway. It wasn't a dangerous trail, just a quiet stretch of forest in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any major roads. It was the kind of place where people went to clear their heads, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. The trail started out easy, a well-worn dirt path cutting through thick trees. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It was peaceful. The air was crisp, cool, and smelled of damp earth. I had everything I needed, enough food for 2 days, extra water, a sturdy tent, a good knife. I wasn't worried. I had hiked dozens of times before. The first few hours passed without incident. Birds chirped above me, the occasional squirrel darted across the path, and the sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. I kept an eye on my map, making sure I was heading in the right direction. The plan was simple: hike out 10 miles, set up camp, and return the next day. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the quiet. It wasn't sudden, not all at once, but it crept in slowly. The birds stopped singing. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves all day, died down. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. It was strange, but I ignored it. Sometimes the forest just got quiet. Animals sensed things before people did. Maybe a storm was coming, or a predator was nearby. I picked up my pace. At mile 8, I came across something unusual. The path curved around a small clearing, and in the middle of that clearing was an old, rusted-out car. It had no windows, no doors, and was half sunken into the earth. The metal was orange with rust, the tires long gone. I stopped, staring at it. It didn't make sense. There were no roads out here, no trails big enough for a vehicle. It had been there a long time. I walked closer, curious. The inside was gutted, just an empty shell. The seats had rotted away, leaving only rusted springs. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. The forest pressed in around me, silent and heavy. I stepped back onto the trail and kept moving. By the time I hit mile 10, the sun was getting low. I found a flat spot off the trail and set up camp. My tent was small, just big enough for one person. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat with my back against a tree, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it. A sound far off in the distance. A snapping branch, a rustle of leaves. I froze, listening. Could have been an animal. Probably was. But the forest was still silent. Too silent. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just on edge from hiking alone. Still, I kept my knife close as I crawled into my tent. The fire burned low outside, casting flickering shadows against the fabric. I lay there for a long time, listening, waiting. Then, another sound. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching against the leaves. I held my breath. My heart pounded. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear breathing, couldn't move. The fire outside crackled softly. The seconds stretched on. Then a long, slow exhale, right outside the tent. I snapped upright, yanking my knife free. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but I couldn't force the words out. My throat was dry, my chest tight. Silence. I stayed frozen, ears straining, heart hammering. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire cast shadows against the tent walls, shifting and flickering. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. No footsteps, no rustling, just gone. I sat there for what felt like hours before finally lying back down, knife still clutched in my hand. I didn't sleep. Not really. Every tiny noise jolted me awake. The forest never went back to normal.
No birds.
No wind. Just silence. To first light, I packed up and started back. I didn't eat, didn't stop. I just walked. At mile 8, I reached the rusted car again. But something was different. Something was wrong. The dirt around it had been disturbed. The leaves, the ground, they had been moved, shifted. And then I saw them. Footprints, leading from the car, leading toward my campsite. They weren't mine. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike. Nothing crazy, just an overnight trip to clear my head. I had done this kind of thing plenty of times before. I had all the gear I needed, a solid GPS, and the forecast was decent. The trail was a little more remote than I usually went for, but that was the appeal. I wanted solitude, just me, the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching along the dirt path. I got to the trailhead around noon, later than I planned. The parking lot was empty except for one old truck with a faded green paint job. I assumed it belonged to a hunter or another hiker farther up the trail. The air was crisp, and the first hour passed easily. The forest was quiet, just the occasional chirp of birds or rustling leaves in the wind. Everything felt normal, but around mile 5, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed thicker, like they were pressing in closer, or how the wind had completely died down, leaving the forest in an unnatural silence. My own footsteps sounded too loud. The air felt heavier. I told myself I was overthinking. That's how people freak themselves out for no reason. So I kept going. I was aiming for a spot near a small lake about 10 miles in. I had seen pictures online. Calm water, a flat clearing for a tent, perfect for an overnight stay. The kind of place people wrote blog posts about. But as I got deeper into the woods, the unease got worse. I started noticing little things. Broken branches on the trail, deeper cuts in the dirt like something heavy had been dragged. It wasn't an animal. The marks were too wide, too deliberate. I checked my GPS, thinking maybe I had veered off trail without realizing it. But I was still on track, just a few miles from the lake. I pushed forward. Then I found the campsite, or what was left of it. The fire pit was cold, scattered with half-burnt logs and ashes. A tent lay collapsed in a heap, partially unzipped, with clothes and gear spilling out. A backpack leaned against a tree, covered in leaves like it had been sitting there for a while. I called out even though I knew better. No answer. I walked closer, my boots crunching over the mess. The tent smelled sour, like old sweat and damp fabric. Inside, a sleeping bag was crumpled in the corner, half pulled out like someone had left in a hurry. A flashlight lay on the ground, its batteries corroded. No blood, no obvious sign of a struggle. But something wasn't right. People don't just abandon their camps like that. I felt the urge to leave, right then, just turn around and hike back the way I came. But I was too far in to make it back before dark, and the thought of walking 10 miles in pitch black wasn't appealing. My best bet was to keep going, reach the lake, and get some rest. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe. I moved fast. My nerves were shot, and every little noise put me on edge. The farther I hiked, the worse the trail got. It was subtle at first, small signs that something wasn't right. Rocks that had been moved, deep scratches in tree trunks at odd heights, like something had been clawing at them. Then the smell hit me. Rot. Something was dead nearby. I knew better than to go looking for it, but the scent followed me, growing stronger with every step. It was thick, cloying, like meat left in the sun too long. My stomach churned, but I kept going. Then I saw it. A deer carcass, torn open, guts spilling out like some sick display. Its legs were twisted at wrong angles, its eyes wide and glassy. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was the fact that its head was missing, not ripped off by an animal. Cut. I wasn't alone. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, my breath coming fast. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. My hands were shaking, and I forced myself to keep moving. The lake had to be close. I didn't want to be out here anymore. The last mile felt like an eternity. Every shadow looked like a person. Every creak of the trees sounded like footsteps. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. Not until I saw the water. The lake was smaller than I expected, dark and still, reflecting the deep gray sky. I found a spot a few yards from the shore, wedged between two large boulders, and set up my tent in record time. I didn't bother with a fire. I barely ate. I just sat there, back against the rock, knife in my lap, listening. And that's when I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. A whistle, 2 notes high then low, came from the trees maybe 50 yards away. My chest tightened. I didn't move. Came again. Same tune. Someone was out there, watching me. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, gripping my knife so hard my fingers went numb. The whistling never came again, but I didn't sleep. The sun took forever to rise. The second there was enough light to see, I packed my gear and bolted. I didn't care how exhausted I was. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to go. The hike back was brutal. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in my peripheral vision. But I didn't. I just kept moving, heart pounding, legs burning. When I reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. The old truck was gone. I got in and locked the doors. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again. I set out early in the morning, just as the sky was starting to brighten with the first hints of daylight. The forest trail was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel small, like the world is bigger than you can comprehend. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, an overnight trip through a remote section of national forest land. The trail wasn't well known, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to get away, disconnect from the world for a little while. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I walked at a steady pace, my backpack sitting comfortably on my shoulders. I had packed light, just enough food, a lightweight tent, a small cooking setup, and the usual emergency gear. I wasn't new to hiking, and I had done my research. This trail had been described as tough but rewarding, with some of the best views in the state. A few hours in, the trail became more rugged. The trees grew denser, and the undergrowth thickened. I had to watch my footing as the path became uneven, with loose rocks and exposed roots waiting to trip me. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how isolated it felt. There were no sounds of distant cars, no buzzing of power lines, just the wind, the rustling leaves, and the occasional chirp of birds. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a perfect spot to rest. I dropped my pack, took a long drink of water, and sat on a fallen log. I ate a protein bar and checked my map. I had covered a good distance, and if I kept my pace, I'd reach my planned campsite before dark. Everything was going smoothly, but as I was about to get up, I noticed something odd. The log I was sitting on had deep scratches, like something had clawed at it. At first, I figured it must have been a bear or some other animal marking its territory, but the grooves looked too deliberate, almost like someone had carved them with a knife. They were long, jagged, and uneven. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough edges. It was strange, but I brushed it off and continued my hike. As the afternoon wore on, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why. The trail was still quiet, the forest still thick, but something felt off. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods alone. But then I noticed something else. The sounds of the forest had changed. The birds were gone. The rustling in the undergrowth had stopped. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept moving, but the unease stayed with me. The trail became harder to follow, and I found myself stopping more often to check my map. The trees all looked the same, and the further I went, the more I felt like I was walking in circles. My GPS still showed I was on track, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. I needed to find my campsite soon. Then I saw it. A tent. Not mine, someone else's. It was old and weathered, barely holding together. The fabric was torn in places, and the poles were bent. It looked like it had been there for a long time. My first thought was that a previous hiker had abandoned it, but as I got closer, I realized how wrong that was. The tent wasn't empty. A backpack sat just outside the entrance, covered in dirt and leaves like it had been there for weeks. A pair of hiking boots, still laced up, lay next to it. But what really made my stomach drop was the fire pit. There were bones in it. Not large ones, nothing that looked human, but small animal bones, picked clean. The ashes were old, but not ancient. Someone had been here. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. Someone else had been or still was out here, and they had left in a hurry, or worse, never left at all. I scanned the woods around me, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound. The silence pressed in. I needed to get out of there. Fast. I turned and started moving, trying not to run but walking as quickly as I could without making noise. My planned campsite was still a mile away, but I wasn't sure I wanted to stay the night anymore. I just needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere I could think. My instincts were screaming at me to go back the way I came, but the thought of walking hours in the dark with that thing, whoever or whatever, potentially behind me made my stomach twist. Then, just as the last of the daylight faded, I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. They were behind me, too far to see but close enough to hear. Slow, deliberate, matching my pace. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the steps continued. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. Whenever I moved, they moved. I reached my planned campsite just as the darkness fully set in. There was a small clearing, just enough space to set up a tent, but I wasn't thinking about that anymore. My hands shook as I pulled out my flashlight, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew someone was out there. Then I saw the scratches on the trees surrounding the clearing, the same deep, jagged marks I had seen on the log earlier. But these were fresh. The bark was still raw and splintered. Someone had done this recently, maybe even today, maybe while I was hiking. I didn't set up camp. I didn't even stay long enough to think. I turned and started back the way I came, moving as fast as I could without running. I kept my flashlight off, relying on the moonlight. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't listen for footsteps anymore. I just moved. I hiked through the night. My legs burned, my feet ached, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of that forest. The feeling of being watched never left me. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I finally saw something familiar. A trail marker I had passed the day before. I wasn't lost. I was almost out. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I kept going until I reached my car, throwing my pack into the back seat and locking the doors before I even caught my breath. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone, emerge from the trees. But nothing came. I never found out who was out there. I never reported it. I didn't want to go back, not even to tell the rangers. Maybe it was just an abandoned campsite. Maybe the scratches were from some animal. Maybe I imagined the footsteps. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And I know I'll never go back there again. I started my hike just after sunrise. The sky still painted in soft hues of pink and orange. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the forest stretched out in front of me like an open invitation. I had planned this trip for weeks, just a solo hike through a remote stretch of wilderness. Nothing too extreme, just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched nature. The trail started off easy, well-worn dirt packed beneath my boots, lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. Birds chirped somewhere above, and I let the rhythm of my footsteps settle into something steady. The first few miles passed quickly. I took short breaks when needed, sipped from my water bottle, checked my map, and pressed on. By noon, I had covered more ground than expected. The trail, which had been clear and defined in the morning, started to narrow. It wound deeper into the forest, and the trees grew thicker, their branches stretching overhead like a tangled web. I wasn't worried. I'd studied the route carefully, had a compass, and a GPS backup if needed. I knew where I was going. As the hours passed, the landscape shifted. The ground turned rocky, uneven. The trees became denser, their branches twisted and gnarled. I checked my map again, my brow furrowing. The trail was supposed to be straightforward, but it felt like I had missed something. Maybe an intersection? A fork in the path? I decided to push forward. The sun hung lower in the sky, the light filtering through the trees in streaks of gold. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and distant wind all seemed to fade. It was just me and my footsteps, crunching softly on the forest floor. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Relieved, I picked up my pace, eager to get a better view of my surroundings. But as I stepped into the open space, something felt off. The grass here was flattened, pressed down in wide, uneven patches. Large stones were scattered about, some partially buried, others stacked in odd formations. I scanned the area, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like a campsite. There was no fire pit, no signs of people. Just those rocks and the silence. My stomach tightened. I had the sudden, unshakable feeling that I shouldn't be there. I turned back the way I came, my steps quick, controlled. The trail, which had been so easy to follow before, now looked different. The trees all seemed the same, the path less defined. I walked faster, keeping my breathing steady, but with each step, unease settled heavier in my chest. Then I saw something ahead, a shape in the trees. Person? No. As I got closer, I realized it was a structure, partially hidden by thick brush. A small wooden cabin, weathered and worn. I hadn't seen any signs of private property on the map. No roads leading to this area, just endless wilderness. But the cabin was there, standing silent among the trees. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. The door was slightly ajar, the wood darkened with age and rot. A single window was boarded up. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step closer. Something creaked inside. I froze. The sound was faint, like weight shifting on old floorboards. I held my breath, straining to hear. Silence. Maybe an animal? Or the wind? I stepped back, heart hammering, and turned away. I needed to get back on track. The moment I moved, a sharp snap echoed from within the cabin, like a branch breaking. That was enough. I took off, forcing myself not to run but walking fast, eyes scanning for anything that looked familiar. My pulse pounded in my ears. I needed to find the trail again, get back on a clear path before it got dark. The trees closed in around me, and every direction looked the same. My breaths came in short bursts. I glanced at my compass, trying to get a bearing, but the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. My stomach dropped. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow, deliberate. Somewhere behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. I started moving again, forcing myself to stay calm. But the footsteps followed. Closer, matching my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I turned sharply, scanning the woods. Still nothing. My skin prickled. I forced my legs to keep moving one step at a time. Then up ahead I saw it. The clearing. The same flattened grass, the same scattered stones. My stomach lurched. How? I had walked in a straight line, hadn't I? Panic clawed at my chest. I was lost. Completely, utterly lost. I forced myself to take a deep breath, steady my hands. I needed to think, to figure out where I went wrong. A sound cut through the silence. A whistle, high-pitched, then low. I didn't move. The sound came again, closer. A whistle like someone calling out. My blood turned to ice. I knew that whistle. It was mine, the one I used with B. The one we had made up years ago. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. My feet pounded against the ground, branches whipping against my arms. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and then a break in the trees, the trail. I nearly collapsed in relief, stumbling onto the worn dirt path. My hands shook as I grabbed my map, reoriented myself. The way back was clear now, familiar. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there, chest heaving. I never looked back. I don't know what happened in those woods, what I saw, what I heard. But I do know one thing. I was never alone out there. I started the hike early, just as the sun was creeping up over the hills. It wasn't a popular trail, just a narrow path through dense forest, winding up the side of a ridge. That's why I picked it. I liked the quiet. No crowds, no distant chatter of other hikers. Just me, the trees, and the steady rhythm of my boots crunching over dirt and fallen leaves. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was cool, and the light cut through the trees in golden slants. I took my time, stopping to take a sip from my water bottle and check the map on my phone. The trail was supposed to loop around and meet up with a fire road about 10 miles in, making for a long but manageable day hike. After about an hour, the trail started to get rougher. The dirt was looser, the incline steeper. I had to slow down, watching my footing carefully. The forest was thick here, the trees pressing in close on either side. Sunlight barely reached the ground, and everything was damp. Moss climbed the trunks of trees, and the air smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. I heard the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but nothing big. Then I noticed something strange. The usual trail markers, small wooden posts or blazes painted on trees, were missing. I hadn't noticed when they stopped, but as I stood catching my breath, I realized I hadn't seen one in a while. I pulled out my phone again. The GPS signal flickered weakly, then dropped completely. No service. I wasn't worried yet. I knew roughly where I was, and I had a compass in my pack just in case. Still, I turned back to see if I had missed a junction somewhere. That's when I saw the footprint. It was in the soft dirt at the edge of the trail, half smudged by fallen leaves. At first, I assumed it was mine, but then I noticed the shape was wrong. The tread pattern didn't match my boots, and it was fresh, too fresh. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become. The usual sounds, bird calls, the distant rustle of leaves, were gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier that morning. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them, but my gut told me otherwise. I turned back and kept walking, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The trail was harder to follow now. Sections of it were washed out, leaving only faint traces of where the path had once been. I kept going, hoping to find a clearer section, but instead, I found something else. A piece of fabric. It was caught on a low branch, faded and torn. Blue, maybe once part of a jacket or backpack. I stopped, staring at it. It didn't look like it had been there long. The edges weren't frayed from weather, and the color hadn't completely faded. I didn't like this, not one bit. I took another look at my phone. Still no signal. I tried not to panic. I wasn't lost, not really. If I turned back now, I could retrace my steps, make it back to the last marker I had seen. But something inside me whispered that I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace, moving faster than I probably should have on the uneven terrain. My foot slipped on loose dirt, and I stumbled, catching myself on a tree trunk. As I righted myself, I saw another footprint. This one was different. It wasn't from a hiking boot. It was barefoot, and it was bigger than mine. My heart started pounding. I forced myself to keep walking, resisting the urge to break into a run. Running was a bad idea. I could twist an ankle or fall, and I was already in a bad enough situation. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty trail stretching behind me. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close, too close. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. The silence was worse than the noise. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. My breathing was too loud, too fast. My hands were shaking. The trail ahead curved around a boulder, disappearing from view. I hesitated. Something in me screamed not to go forward, but I didn't have much of a choice. I stepped around the boulder and stopped dead. The path was gone, not overgrown, not washed out, just gone, as if it had never been there. My stomach twisted. I turned in a slow circle, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. I should have been able to see where I had just come from, but the trees looked different, closer together. Then I saw the footprints, barefoot, fresh, leading toward me. I didn't think. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my pack slamming against my back. My only thought was to get away. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then, finally, I saw something through the trees, an old fire road. I stumbled onto it, gasping for breath, and turned to look behind me. Nothing. The forest was still. I didn't wait. I followed the road, moving as fast as I could until I saw a ranger station in the distance. When I finally made it inside, I tried to explain what had happened, but the ranger just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no trail out there," he said. "Hasn't been for years." I didn't argue. I just nodded, thanked him, and left. I haven't been hiking alone since. I had planned the trip for weeks, a solo hike through a remote section of wilderness, far from the overcrowded trails I usually found myself on. The idea was to push myself, cover more distance, carry more gear, spend a few nights in total isolation. I wanted the challenge. I wanted the solitude. It was supposed to be an escape. The drive out took half the day. Miles of highway gave way to winding mountain roads, then dirt paths barely wide enough for my truck. The trailhead was marked only by a small, weather-worn sign, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. No other cars were parked there. That was what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just the sound of my boots on the dirt and the wind through the trees. I started hiking around noon, making good time despite the weight of my pack. The first stretch of the trail was well-maintained, cutting through dense forest, sunlight filtering through the leaves. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. A few miles in, the trail changed. It became rougher, less traveled. The incline steepened. My legs burned. My breath came harder. I welcomed the effort. There was something deeply satisfying about moving forward under my own power, knowing each step took me further from the world I had left behind. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a flat clearing near a small stream. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and ate a quick meal. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the place unsettled me. I ignored the feeling. I was alone in the woods, that was all. My mind playing tricks on me. I let the fire burn down low, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. A slow, deliberate rustling. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was steady, too steady. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint red light on the walls of my tent. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Not the light, erratic steps of a deer or the quick scurry of a raccoon. Heavy, human. I reached for the knife strapped to my pack. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here? I hadn't seen another soul all day. There was no reason for anyone to be this deep into the wilderness in the middle of the night. My fingers tightened around the handle of the knife. The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. Couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to run, but I stayed frozen. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the steps started again, moving away this time. I waited until the sound had faded completely before I dared to move. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I swept the beam of light across the trees. Nothing. The clearing was empty. My firewood pile was undisturbed. My pack was right where I had left it. But there, just at the edge of the clearing, were footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, deeper than my own, and they led from the trees right up to my tent, then back into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in my lap, watching the darkness until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. By morning, the footprints were still there. I checked my surroundings carefully. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of a camp, no abandoned gear, no indication that anyone had been there aside from those tracks. I thought about turning back, but part of me, the stubborn part, the part that didn't want to be scared off, pushed forward. Maybe it had been another hiker, someone who had gotten lost and stumbled upon my camp by accident. Maybe they had realized their mistake and left before waking me up. It was an excuse, and I knew it, but I kept going anyway. The second day's hike was harder. The trail grew narrower, overgrown in places. The trees pressed closer, the underbrush thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. By the time I set up camp that evening, I was exhausted. I forced myself to eat, to go through the motions of making camp like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The night passed without incident.
No footsteps, no estrange noises.
But that didn't make me feel any better. On the third day, I reached the halfway point of my route. That was when I found the second set of footprints. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old at most, and they were following mine. I stared at them for a long time. Someone was out here. Someone was following me. I had no idea why, no idea who, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't some lost hiker. This wasn't coincidence. I turned around. I pushed hard on the way back, covering more ground than I should have. My legs ached. My pack dug into my shoulders, but I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I just moved, fast, trying to put as much distance between me and whoever was out there. As night fell, I had no choice but to stop. My body couldn't go any further. I set up camp hastily, skipping the fire, eating a cold meal from my pack. I kept my knife close, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, not stopping at the edge of my camp, but moving toward me. Slow, deliberate. I didn't wait. I grabbed my knife, my flashlight, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care about my gear. My only thought was getting out, getting back to the trailhead, getting to safety. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs nearly gave out. Then, finally, I saw it, the dirt road, my truck parked right where I had left it. I fumbled with my keys, heart hammering, hands shaking. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, the trees, the empty space where the path disappeared into the woods. Empty. I didn't waste time. I tore out of there, gravel flying behind me, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back, never reported it. What would I have said? That I heard footsteps? That I saw footprints? That someone was out there, following me? Even now, I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods.